being a lawyer, was there somebody in your family? Was your mom, your dad? Was that any of interest?
No, there was no one in my family. I was the first person in my family to go to college, let alone graduate school. I did not know a single lawyer growing up.
Whereabouts did you grow up?
Massachusetts.
Massachusetts?
Mm-hmm.
And whereabouts?
In Belmont and Needham.
Okay. So you're a Boston Red Sox person growing up?
Oh, absolutely. You better believe it.
Ted Williams forever.
Carl Yastrzemski.
Oh, yes. Okay. All right. And what'd your dad do for a living?
My dad did a number of things. I don't know. You probably don't want to get into a lot of detail about them.
Your kids might find this of interest, so go ahead.
Okay, so, yeah. It might be the only way they find out. They're often not interested in this stuff. My dad is a living example of the American dream. I don't know if he considers himself that or not. His parents were immigrants from Russia, and my grandfather died when my father was a boy, and my grandmother did not speak English, and of course had not worked. And so as soon as he was able, my father went out to work in the supermarket as a checkout boy. He carried groceries to the cars and things like that, and he literally worked his way up. And he obviously never went to college, but at the point that the supermarket chain was sold, it was Elm Farm Supermarkets, and I don't know, they maybe had like 75 grocery stores. He was senior vice president of marketing or something, so he literally had worked himself all the way up, and then the market chain was sold, and he was without a job. And all his life, he had wanted to be a stockbroker. And at this point, he's in his 40s, and I believe I was a senior in high school at this point. He went and knocked on every brokerage house in Boston, and nobody would have him because he was too old and had no college education. The very last brokerage house he knocked on was Laidlaw and Company, and they must have seen something in him, and they decided to take a chance, and they sent him off to stockbroker school for the summer, and that was the summer before I went to college. Laidlaw was bought out. I'm not sure I remember all these details may all not be entirely accurate. I think they were bought out. At any rate, he went to work for Payne Weber. I saw the USB office, or US, I'm thinking of computers.
Yeah.
UBS. UBS, when I came down your hallway. At any rate, he became one of the top 10 stockbrokers in the country for Payne Weber. And so they turned out to be very glad that they had taken a chance on him. This was all after I'd left home. But when you ask what he did for a living, I guess it was, I think of him as a stockbroker, certainly, and he still follows the market. He's still alive. He's 96. Wow. But he had more than one career.
Was he a World War II guy?
No, he had flat feet. I have his feet, unfortunately, and I have horrible foot problems, as did he, and they wouldn't take him. And I remember being shocked to think that would keep you out of the Army, but I guess if you carry a backpack and go on long marches, you've got to have an arch. And I know that firsthand. Yeah. And
you graduate from high school in Massachusetts, go to college where?
UMass.
And then decide to go to law school? What precipitated that?
I went to college, and then I put myself through college myself. My parents couldn't help me, and it's funny now that I'm retired. It's like I've never talked about this. I literally never told anyone because I thought, I don't know why, it seemed like inappropriate. but I wanted to be a social worker. And I was going to do social work. And I got a social work job after college. I graduated early, and so that January I started working as a social worker. And it was the first time I'd ever dealt with lawyers. And at the agency, I promptly realized that it was not a good career for me, because if you really wanted to do something worthwhile, you were doing nothing but butting your head against a wall. And that the people who had the power to affect positive change or make anything happen were lawyers. Because there were lawyers coming into our office constantly every day, and they were the ones we turned to try to assist us in accomplishing anything. So, and this is the part that I don't talk about. On a whim, I decided to apply to both graduate school in social work and law, and I heard from law first.
My gosh. It's amazing. I mean, that curve, you know.
Yeah, so it really was totally serendipitous.
Yeah. And where did you go to law school?
UB.
UB?
Yeah. I was a resident of New York at the time, and I put myself through law school. In fact, when I told my parents I was going to law school, they said, "What for?"
Had you met Bob at that point?
No.
Okay. So you went to, so did you have side jobs? What did you do to put yourself through college? And
I worked all the way through in college. I worked in the dining commons. I worked in an art gallery. I took a survey. I took surveys of other people. Oh my gosh. I think I worked for the Visiting Nurse Association for a semester. I had, a bunch of odd jobs all the way through, but I was always working all the way through college. And then through law school, I worked for a law professor and helped him with his research. It was Barry Boyer. And I worked with the jail counseling project at the Erie County Jail. I think I did that for a year. Oh, I can't remember. I always had a job.
And you graduated from law school in Buffalo, what year?
75.
75. So 1 year before me.
Right.
As it turns out. And so then you've got to make a decision. You get your degree and you just kind of decide, where might I want to be? Or what I want to do. Did you have a sense when you got your degree?
No, I don't really remember going through that. I think it was more a matter of I would go where someone would take me. There weren't a lot of women in law school at the time, and there was a lot of discrimination, and people didn't want to hire us. And I had some very traumatic interviews where people asked what kind of birth control I would use if they hired me, and what kind of clothes I would wear, and what I would do if my husband were home sick with a cold. That was really the most incredible question. I would have loved to have been able to give the answers that came to mind, but of course I didn't. So I don't think that any of us felt we had a lot of wiggle room in terms of, I'd really like to do this.
Was there an active women's law group at that time at UB?
There weren't enough women to have an active women's. Really, our class was one of the first classes to have more than, say, 5 women out of, I don't remember how many. There was a couple hundred students in our class.
Wow.
And we had, I think, about 30 women. And that was considered a huge amount. So we did get together and share our horror stories from our job interviews and what was happening. And we were all frightened, I think, that we weren't going to be able to find a job, unless you, of course, were well connected and had, people that you knew, family, friends, whatever, who could assist you. It was a struggle for everybody.
So you're a Massachusetts native from going to law school in Western New York. And by the way, why did you choose Buffalo?
I was a New York resident at the time, and it's the only state law school in New York.
That's right. And the price is a lot different, tuition,
Yes.
I remember that.
Right.
Why were you a New York resident?
After I graduated, I went to work at a job on Long Island.
So Long Island, Western New York, there you go.
Right.
So ultimately, were you able to find a location where they would employ you?
Oh, right, yes. I got a job in Albany, and I went to work for the Governor's Health Planning Commission. Hugh Carey was governor back then, and I got this call just out of the blue. I didn't apply for the job, and this fellow, his name was David Solomon, was on the line, and he said that they had contacted the law school and they needed to hire a lawyer, and the law school, the job placement office had given them my name. And would I be interested? And he met me in Syracuse, and I went through this whole sort of grilling and got hired. And yeah, so that's where I went to work.
How long were you there?
I was there, I think, a little over a year. Fascinating experience. We worked with the legislative committees that introduced all the laws relating in any way to health, mental health, social welfare, that type of thing. Spent a lot of time down in New York City for that job. I was stationed in Albany at the Capitol, but we were constantly riding the train down to New York City to meet with the legislative committees, etc., drafting the bills and working to get them enacted. It was a very interesting job. And then Bob and I got married, and he was in St. Lawrence County already. And so I moved to St. Lawrence County after we were married and got a job there.
Now, Bob, was he still in pharmacy school at the time?
No, he was in law school.
Law school, okay. Was he in pharmacy?
Yes, he was. He was a pharmacist after he went to pharmacy school, and then he went to law school.
Okay. I knew there was,
Yeah.
I'll get the details Monday. Okay. So you get married, you're in St. Lawrence, and he's a Faulkner native, Faulkner, New York native. When did you guys decide, or how did you decide to kind of come here?
Well, he always wanted to come here.
Okay.
For him, there was no question. He wanted to come back to Chautauqua County. I had never lived in a really rural area before in my life. I was an urban girl and used to the amenities of cities. Just had never lived in any place that had many different qualities than I was used to, and his family was still here at the time. And so I realized that if we did move back here and it didn't work, it would be very difficult to extract ourselves. And I didn't want to upset his family. I really loved Bob's family, and so I said to him, I don't think that I can do that without living somewhere else like it first. And that's how we ended up in he went to St. Lawrence County first, okay. But that was partly why, so that I could try out living in what to me was a rural, isolated area. And we lived there for 2 years, and I actually enjoyed it very much. I liked it and realized I could live in Chautauqua County without a problem. And then sort of at the end of 2 years, we came to a turning point because we both had been offered better jobs there in St. Lawrence County. And so we had to decide if we were going to accept those jobs or come back here. And he always wanted to come back. That was always his inclination. I was happy where I was, although I didn't think I'd be unhappy here. So we sat down and literally made up a pro and con list. And we had a pro and con for St. Lawrence and pro and con for Chautauqua. And Chautauqua won.
Wow, that's fascinating. So here you came, but you didn't have this was starting brand new. This is Van Every and Claire. For the camera, because many people are sort of young and hanging out their own shingles, what was your experience like of starting new? Now I realize Bob was from Faulkner, so that's a leg up. But what was the experience like?
It was very challenging at first, and it was scary. I remember we had read all the statistics about how, I don't remember them exactly, but it was something like 50% of all new ventures collapse within 12 months and 90% within 5 years. And we had one employee, our secretary, Debbie Ekstrom, and it was a good week if we earned enough money to pay Debbie. Mm-hmm. And we didn't take a salary at first, of course. And so I can remember, it being very sort of like a frightening thing. We stuck with it. We passed the 1 year and then the 5 years and then beyond that. And there were always people coming in the door, as I recall. And I don't remember ever really being worried that we were going to sink or anything. There was always business, and people generally seemed happy and coming back and referring their friends, and it went okay.
As I recall, you had a house, wasn't it? Is that your office? Was that you initially? Was that where you were initially?
No. We were at 230 East Main, which is an office building. We were on the lower floor. Okay. It was Fred Giddy's chiropractic office, if you know that building.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
And it had a parking lot and everything. And we were there for several years before we moved over to the Four Corners and bought, that used to be the Town of Ellicott building. And then it was a funeral parlor. Huh. There was a big, enormous walk-in safe there from when it was the Town of Ellicott building.
Gosh.
We used to store all our dead files in there.
That's what I remember. Did you have a niche? How did you and Bob decide?
At first, we both did everything.
Yeah.
And I think very rapidly we discovered that didn't make sense. I loved trial work. I was always drawn to trial work. And Bob really liked transactional work. So we separated that way. Mm-hmm. He did taxes and real estate and trusts and God knows all those things. And I basically handled the litigation.
Did you gravitate at all to the family court? Everybody had a chance by the judges letting you know that if you were alive and could breathe and you had a law degree, you became kind of appointed guardian for something. Did you gravitate towards that? Some people resented being asked, but is that something you enjoyed doing?
I was on the guardian ad litem panel the whole time I was practicing, and probably had hundreds of cases. Enjoy is sort of an odd word because the cases were often very disturbing and troubling. So I don't know that I'd say I enjoyed it, but I certainly found it extremely worthwhile. I wouldn't say that I gravitated to what at the time was called domestic relations law. I think rather it chose me. Many of my clients came in, and I think I started doing matrimonial law, and I think that the clients maybe went and told their friends or whatever, because it seemed like those people were coming in more than anyone else after a time. And probably about, I'd say 50% of my practice, I'd say a good half of my practice became strictly domestic relations and matrimonial law. I was always on the law guardian panel. That was a minority of my work, but I was always in that area. And yeah, so I think I felt that it chose me. That's what people really started coming to me for after a while.
There was a point in time where I think it was the family court judge, and it may have been under your time, where you had to be certified. I mean, in other words, to argue or to be representing in the family court representing.
You're talking about guardian ad litem now?
Yeah, I think I am. In the old days, and I'm dating myself perhaps, but you'd get a call from the court and simply say, Greg, you're appointed for this child, show up.
Right.
And you'd say, wait a minute, I don't even know how to spell objection. Do you really want me? Well, there was a reason. Often the judge would get on the phone, and it might have been you, it might have been Lynn, I'm not sure. But simply saying, we need a little more of a Solomon approach towards this, rather than knowing all the procedures and the criminal law stuff. And then at some point, you had to go and be qualified and to take exams and stuff like that. Was that something you instituted?
No, it definitely wasn't something I instituted. That came from New York State.
Okay.
And that was while I was on the bench.
Okay.
I had nothing to do with it, and they did require that all people who served as guardian ad litems go through continuing education and be certified. After I was on the bench a couple of years, I was appointed to the State Family Court Advisory and Rules Committee. And I served on that committee for a long time. After I retired, I stayed on it, and then eventually I chose to get off it. But that would have been the sort of thing that would have come out of that committee, and been vetted by the state, and then become a law or a regulation, as the case would be.
Makes perfect sense to have qualified, fully trained people to do that, rather than just simply have a law degree. At some point, did you turn to Bob and say, I think I could run for judge?
No, I did not. No, I never thought about being a judge. Well, Ted Smith, who I don't think I even knew that well at the time, had called up. I mean, I knew him. Obviously, he called me up and asked me to have lunch, and we went and had lunch. And he asked me if I'd ever thought about running for judge. And no, I had not ever thought about running for judge. I never wanted to be a judge. I never dreamed of being a judge. All the things that people have asked me over the years, oh, did you always want to be a judge? No, I had never considered it ever. And I went home and discussed it with Bob. Bob thought it was a terrible idea. His family thought it was an even worse idea. And I thought about it, and I decided I was going to go for it. And it was probably one of the riskiest and most daring things I've done in my life. I felt I could lose my practice by running, and that frightened me if I lost. And there were a lot of other considerations going on there as well. But I decided to go ahead and I ran.
And the first time through, it didn't end up the way you wanted it to.
The first time I ran, it was so interesting. I did not know much about politics. I was not a politician. I was probably pretty naive. And it was a presidential year. We had a terrible presidential candidate. It was Michael Dukakis. And so there was a very low Democratic turnout. You had to run aligned with a party, which I didn't agree with, but it's the law in New York State. I don't feel that family court judge is a political position. It's not. But obviously Jamestown is the biggest Democratic turnout, and there was a very low turnout in Jamestown that year because people didn't really believe in Dukakis, so they just didn't vote at all. And there were lots of other things going on. But at any rate, the larger point was that no one gave me a chance. I was an unknown. There'd never been a woman judge. And everybody said, well, you know, you're going to lose. And it was only in the last few weeks that people started sort of sitting up and noticing our campaign and all the things we were doing and jumping on the bandwagon, but it was really a little late. But at any rate, on election night, oh gosh, I don't remember the exact figures, but I think he got, and at the time, that was another factor, the county was significantly registered more Republican than Democrat. We each got about 28,000 votes. And I was actually ahead. But I was ahead by about 97 votes, if you can imagine, out of 50-some, almost 60,000 votes. It was that close. So we had to go to the absentee ballots. And it was around Thanksgiving before we got the final results.
Oh, yeah.
It took that long. And of course, the absentee ballots break heavily Republican. It was mostly military and people out of the area. And he ended up winning by less than 1%. I don't remember the exact breakdown. And I remember at the time it was, I'll use the word devastating emotionally. It doesn't feel at all devastating now when I look back, but that was so long ago. But I think it was because I really worked hard. I gave 130 speeches during the time I was campaigning, and I was out almost like 15 hours a day. And I think that when you do anything that intensely and then it's over and you haven't got what you were working for, you sort of, I don't know, go into a funk. I think I went into a funk, but it didn't last that long. And, you know, then I was back at work.
You're concerned that running and not succeeding the first time might affect your practice. Was that the case, or did you find that because of your exposure, it enhanced your practice?
I would say it probably enhanced it.
Yeah. But you continue to do, that was your principal focus, was sort of litigation / domestic relations work. Yeah. Then the opportunity presents itself again to run for family court.
Well, in the meantime, let me think. That was in 1988. I think that was in 1988. And then in 1992, I went to work for Judge Gerasi as his clerk.
I forgot about that.
And that was an accident too. That was another job I didn't apply for. It was, my life has sort of just all been serendipitous.
Yeah.
So I had a trial with Dale Robbins, and it was a multi-day trial. I really think it's amazing sometimes when I look back on this. And it was with Judge Cass, so we were over on the Jurassic office building side, and it was the end of the day. It was like 5 o'clock, and I come through the rotunda in the old courthouse, and Judge Jurassic, who had just been elected, but hadn't started his term yet, it's still November, I think, comes out of that area where the old Supreme Court used to be, and he says, "Judith, can I grab you for a minute?" And I said, "Sure." And so we went in, and he said, "I have to hire a clerk." And he said, "All these people have applied. And I was just wondering if you'd give me a few minutes of your time and give me your thoughts on them." And I said, "Oh, sure, I can do that." And so we went down this list of names. And I never realized that he was hoping that I would say, "Well, what about me?"
Yeah.
And I didn't, because I didn't realize that's what he was after. And so I'm saying, "Oh, this person would be really good. You should hire this person." Or this, "No, this person is bad news. They're irresponsible. They have poorly written pleadings, and they're always untimely," or whatever. I remember going through this whole long list. And any rate, then I went home. And then I got a phone call from somebody I highly respected, who was friendly with Judge Jurassic, who said, "Well, Judge Jurassic was hoping that you might be interested."
That's amazing.
And so at any rate, I was interested that time.
Yeah.
That time, that was something I knew I would leap at. Unlike all the other things where I sort of hemmed and hawed and pulled out my hair, that was one where the opportunity to work for him was amazing. He is brilliant, and his mind moves so fast. And I loved the quickness of his mind. And he was always off in a million directions, and he was always thinking of creative ways to deal with things. And if there was a problem, he didn't want to hear why it wouldn't work. He only wanted to know what would work. So it was like I was able to do magic. And yes, so I was there in 98 when the next election rolled around for family court.
And obviously decided to go ahead and run again, and with results being different.
Yes.
How'd you feel that night? 1998, results are in.
Exhausted. Exhausted. I was obviously pleased and happy. It was a very memorable night.
Did it dawn on you at the time, from just a historical experience, that you were the first female Chautauqua County judge?
I was the first female judge. I was the first Democratic judge. I'll point out that I'm still the only female judge and the only Democratic judge that there's ever been in this county, even today. I was worried that 10 years later people wouldn't remember me, and that it would be a whole different world when I was out there running. I was surprised by the number of people who remembered when I would go out in the campaign trail. And I went everywhere. I mean, a lot of places I went, people would say, "We've never had, a candidate for any office here, let alone a judicial one." But yeah, I was aware of that. Those things became issues when I ran. There was some ugliness. Fortunately, I think it was minor, but there was some ugliness during the campaigns where I was attacked for being a woman or, various things.
Hey, let's just segue back a little bit before we get into your tenure as a judge. When you did come here and started in the late 70s, there weren't many female members of the bar. Julia Wilson was my first knowledge of that here when I came. Of course, my wife shortly thereafter, and of course you. But I'm not sure there was anybody else.
There wasn't. Julie was, when I first came, which was in '76, there was Julie. And then Cindy and I sort of came, I think, approximately at the same time. Yeah. And so we used to swap some stories back then. But Julie had warned me, because I asked her out to lunch because she was the only woman. And shortly after I came and Cindy came, Julie left the practice of law to go to divinity school.
I forgot that.
And Julie told me when we went to lunch, and when Julie left, by the way, that left Cindy and I. And that was it. At any rate, Julie said that she would be criticized for her clothing. She lived in Sinclairville on a farm, I think. And they made fun of her because she, I guess, had barn boots on once or something. I don't remember these details anymore, but I remember her telling me that it had been very difficult and she was very disillusioned. She did not give me optimism about practicing here. And it was many years before I ever had a case with another woman. Yeah. And when I did, it was up in Buffalo at a deposition.
Yeah, and I just flashing back. Was she still married? Was she married to Brian still?
She was married to Brian then.
Yeah. Just total segue, but Brian came back a few years ago, and we went to the Jackson Center, gave a tour, and I interviewed him about him. Fascinating.
Absolutely.
Fascinating.
Absolutely.
And his just ironically, his groups, when he lost his legs in that whole incident with the train, was called the Nuremberg Group. Right. Nuremberg. And I go, well, you're kidding me. So he explained that whole relationship in Small World Department. So you and really Cindy are in the forefront of all that, and even as you look in the 1987 composite, a few more, but not many more. Did you find that though in your practice that where attorneys may not have they would sort of use the term discrimination, but they're maybe been subtle? Did you feel that?
With some, yeah. Not with most. Yeah. Most were always very appropriate, but there were some who were absolutely not. Yeah. And I won't ask names. No, you give me names. I know, so I do that. So now you're a judge, and there's that day when you walk into the cloakroom and all of a sudden put on the robes for the first time, and you walk out onto the bench, and the judge says, "All rise, Judge Claire." Do you remember that? I do. What do you remember about that? What were your emotions? I remember that I forgot to put my robe on. Really? I did. I remember seeing this look of horror on Frank's face and thinking, oh my God, what's wrong? And he's like trying to gesture. And I looked down and I realized I didn't have my robe on, and I had literally set foot in the courtroom, but just my foot. Yeah. And I pivoted, like on a pivot, just turned and walked out very calmly and went back and put on my robe. But I mean, I had never been a judge before. I wasn't used to wearing a robe, and I didn't think about it. Yeah. So you get out there finally, and in front of the bench, and you look out, and there's counsel. Did you feel a sense of kind of an emotional, maybe cathartic moment there? No, I really didn't. I don't remember feeling much of anything, except maybe fear, being frightened. You don't become a judge all at once with the experience or wisdom or whatever that implies overnight just because you're elected. You have to earn that. And that took a while. So I'd say that probably if I felt any emotion, it was fear. But I don't remember that. I remember I was confronted with so many problems of people, and I was responsible for them now. And just wanting very much to do a good job and be a force for something positive. I don't know how to articulate it well, but I think that's really, really what I was thinking about. You know what? I do remember something now. Don't know if you're familiar. I'm going to be able to talk about this. Are you familiar with the musical Annie?
Yeah, of course.
So in Annie, I think at the very beginning, they sing, "It's a hard knock life." This is gonna make me seem like a total idiot. They sing, "It's a hard knock life," and then Annie sings, "Maybe." And on the way to Mayville that morning, those songs came on. I never heard those songs on the radio. I don't know why they came on, but they did. And I heard them and I thought, I am responsible now for these families and these children. And I had an obligation. I had to do a good job. And it felt frightening and overwhelming. But I was determined to do the good job. And I think those are what I remember. I don't remember feeling jubilant or anything, although I'm sure I probably was. Yeah, that was pretty much it.
So did Bob give you a hug that morning and say, "Good luck, Judge"?
He probably did. Bob was extremely supportive. I couldn't have been elected without him. He has a wonderful strategic mind, and although he had been opposed to my running, he couldn't have worked harder or been more supportive. I couldn't have done it without him. He knew that this was something that I was determined to do, and fully supported that.
And during your tenure, and we spent some time, not a lot of time, but we spent some time at a CLE at the Jackson Center, honoring 40 years of family court, and much of, for those who want to watch YouTube, it's much of what Judge Claire did is elaborated there, and it was really, really quite a day. But as you hearken back, and it was 20 years?
On the bench, yeah.
20 years on the bench. Do you have kind of a highlight reel for yourself of certain initiatives that, as you've just said, it's a hard knock life, and that's your kind of custodial obligation as judge to help out as best you can, that you were able to move that ball along a certain continuum?
There's a lot of things. There were certain cases that never leave you, where we were able to make a difference for a family or a child. There were all the adoptions, and I'm talking about adoptions where we went all the way through from when the child first came into care, and there was the termination of parental rights, and then the child ending up in a loving home, and then the family coming back and adopting more children, and you'd see the same children years later in their growing family. I mean, there are some cases where nothing in the world practically can compare to the joy and satisfaction you get from that type of thing, to know that you were able to work with parents who turned their lives around, and that you were able to be a part of that. There's a lot of brave people who come to family court faced down their demons, our drug court, the people who got sober. We had one of the most successful drug courts in the state, and we were one of the first rural family treatment courts in the state. Family treatment drug courts never really caught on. They were a lot of work. And when I left, ours folded. But by the time I left, it had been around for 12 or 13 years. And we kept track of our graduates, and almost all of them stayed sober and clean, got their families back, were able to raise healthy children, and we broke the cycle. I saw a lot of tragedy, but I also had the benefit of seeing all that joy, and I think that they go together. In order to experience the really true intense joys, you have to experience some of the tragedy. So those were certainly highlights. And then of the initiatives, the trauma initiative, CASA, our mediation, there were about 20 of them. But there was a handful of them that just really made a difference, and were certainly highlights. CASA's still going strong today. You know, those things, if you give someone a lifeline, for so many people, they just grab it and they keep pulling. And I felt like I was so lucky because I got to see that and be a part of that. And you know, that's something I'll always have. I still have people come up to me. I don't remember if I talked about this. I'm sure I must have mentioned it at the Jackson Center thing, where people will just come up out of the blue at gas stations or restaurants or Taco Hut across the street and say, "Hi, remember me?" And they'll say, you helped me turn my life around. I can tell you so many stories where that's happened. And, you know, how could I not be lucky to have that? So.
How satisfying. At some point, you, again, wake up one morning and look at Bob and your term is up and you decide, I'm not going to run again. Is that hard?
I left before my term was completely up. I had my first grandchild born, and at the time, it was my son, Ben, and they were living in California. And the first year of Braden's life, I didn't get to see him very much, and that stunk. I was thinking, this isn't for me. I'm not gonna not be a part of my grandchildren's life. And our calendar was so intense. I mean, if you were gonna take time off, you practically had to move heaven and earth, and you had to put it in months and months and months ahead of time. And people were always surprised to hear this, but we had one of the busiest caseloads in the state. Not because Chautauqua County is so busy necessarily, although it is, but because until Judge Piazza came, there was only one of me. And for our caseload, even though there's 4 times as many cases in Erie County, but there's 3 times as many judges. In other words, there were like 9 family court judges in Erie County, and there was 1 judge in Chautauqua County, but they only had 3 times as many cases. So I couldn't just leave and say, well, I'm going to take this week off and go on a whim. Plus, you can't just jump in the car and drive to California on a whim either. And so I really seriously started thinking about retiring at that point. And then he did come, and that did make a difference, and I felt like the court was going to be fine without me. You know, it would go on just fine. And I remember Bob said, what will happen to all the initiatives? And I said, you know, somebody else will come and maybe they'll have different ideas and want to do different things, and that's their prerogative, and I don't own them. That was okay. I felt like I had fulfilled my time, and I felt good about what I had accomplished. And I wanted to be a grandmother. And I also wanted to leave before I got burnt out. Mm-hmm. It's a job that can really burn you out. I don't know if you knew... Oh, why is his name just gone out of my head? But he was in the class ahead of me, and he became a family court judge. And he heard a terrible child abuse case, and they had a recess, and he got up off the bench and went out and had a heart attack and died. Yeah. And I didn't want to burn out. I didn't want to get bitter. I wanted to leave while I was still excited about the work. And so the timing just felt right.
You regret it?
No, not at all. Never have regretted it. No, it was so intense. Everybody told me I was making a huge mistake. Everyone. You know, they all said, oh, you're used to being so busy all the time. You're not going to like it. You're going to be unhappy. You're going to be bored. You're going to be restless. And I wasn't. I don't know. I think it was a good decision. It was at the right time. If I'd done it earlier, I think those things might have happened. But the timing was good. And I get to see my grandkids now, you know, whenever I want.
By the way, full disclosure for the camera, it's to be known that Judge Claire had delivered a child on the same day that my wife, Cindy, delivered a child. So the two women, the lawyers in Chautauqua County, have much more in common than you might think.
And for full disclosure purposes, I always know Greg's birthday.
That's right.
Because extraordinarily, not did Cindy and I just give birth in the same 24 hours, but Bob's mother and your mother had babies. So that's what made it really freaky.
You're right, I forgot about that. Yes, all true. If you want, I always try to end up our sessions with sort of looking at a composite, and you may float through there and you may look and see somebody and you may say, here's kind of an interesting vignette or a story or something that you might want to share, because I find that everybody's got something about somebody. If anything jumps, I would feel free to say it.
A lot of people I haven't thought about in a long time. I loved David Blossom.
Yes.
Oh, I loved David Blossom, and we spent a lot of time with he and Margaret. He was such an amazing human being. And Trip was wonderful too. Trip was very helpful to me the first time I ran. You know, I just think of all the support and everything. He was a great person. We all look so young.
It's merely 34 or 5 years ago.
Huh. Some of these people I don't even remember. Elizabeth Marshall?
I don't.
Oh my God, Greg, you look really young.
What? It hasn't changed.
How old were you? You look like you were about 16.
Probably threw in that picture, my high school picture.
That is so funny. Oh, look at Bev.
Now, you had some law clerks, didn't you, during your time in family court judge?
Yes.
For the record, who were some of them?
Well, Bev, we hired right out of law school. I was still in practice at the office, with Bob then. And when Bev graduated from law school, we were friends then. I knew her already. And we hired her and we trained her to become a lawyer. And she was very active in the practice and worked for us for several years. I think right up through the birth of Mary, her last child, if I recall correctly. At any rate, when I became a judge, I only had 2 law clerks, Margaret Logan,
Yes.
and then Margaret became a court attorney referee. And when she became the court attorney referee, I hired Bev to be my law clerk, and she was for all of the remaining time. So from 2007 until I retired, Bev was my law clerk. Yeah.
As judge, it can be pretty lonely. Yeah. Did you have somebody that you could kind of call and just muse about? Something that's just happening in chambers, and it's just really you and the clerk talking, or just get on the phone and call one of the other judges. Do you have a go-to person?
If I had a go-to person, it was Bob. It is lonely being a judge, and it's particularly lonely being a judge when you're the only judge. Mm-hmm. I used to live for the family court conferences, which were once a year, just because I would get to talk to other family court judges. I never got to talk to them. And we had all this education, but we would always have a breakout session where we could just talk about anything. And those were very much participated in and well attended, I think, because we sort of had the problems of the world on our shoulders, so to speak, and everybody was eager to hear from their fellow family court judges. And for me, it was the only time. Like I said, there were all those family court judges in Erie County. They could just walk down the hall and plop themselves in the seat of another judge and say, "Oh my God, you wouldn't believe this. What do you think I should do?" But I didn't have that luxury. Yeah. From time to time, there were other family court judges that I would call in other places, but I didn't do that a lot because it seemed sort of burdensome to call someone in a way that was different from just wandering by their office. But Bob, I think, probably carried a burden because he was one of the only people I felt able to vent to or share my woes, that type of thing.
You ever, in a family court, could be highly temperate, or intemperate, I should say, intemperate. Did you ever have scenarios where you worried about your safety?
Oh yeah, all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just goes with the territory.
Yeah.
That's not family court. That's probably any judge. I know Judge Ward was very fearful for his safety at times as a county court judge. But family court judges do things that affect people more directly than anything. If you take away someone's parental rights in a termination case, you're taking their children away from them. There were people who told me point blank they were going to kill me. There were people who made threats. We had mentally ill people in court on a regular basis. I don't mean all the time, but it was not unusual at all for people who had serious mental health issues to be in court, and you never knew what they would do. There were times when I knew the FBI was involved, or I would get a call from court security up in Erie County, which is where everything was cycled through, and they'd say, we're just calling to let you know that something, they won't give you the details, which is almost worse than, better to not tell you than to just have you be scared. But it you know, it went with the territory. During the time that I was on the bench, there was a family court judge that was murdered. There was another case, I think out by Binghamton, where they killed somebody in the judge's family. So yeah, you thought about your security probably quite a bit. I mean, I saw it as something that went with the territory and tried not to obsess about it, and I think most of the time I was successful.
Was there a time? Was there a time or two where you knew something was going to be volatile, where there was extra security? You asked them to come in.
Many more than a time or two.
Yeah.
And I never called anybody in for extra security. That was the court, the chief clerk's decision.
Okay, they made that.
So it was Dave Turnbull, and then it was Frank Viggiano. They would make the decision, and we had many cases where we had extra security, and we had many cases where people went berserk and acted out and had to be restrained.
Mm-hmm. Was Moose there at the time?
Oh, Moose was there. Moose was there the day I was assaulted. That was before I was a judge. I have so many stories. I sometimes think I should write a book. I have so many stories. But so I had a trial in front of Judge Hartley, and I had just finished cross-examining this gentleman on the stand. No, I cross-examined his wife. That's what it was. He wasn't a party in the lawsuit. I had cross-examined his wife, and Judge Hartley called a recess. We went out in the hallway, and within seconds, the husband of the woman I just cross-examined lunged at me, put his hands around my throat, and started choking and shaking me and screaming at the top of his lungs. And Moose came running down the hall, and I mean, all the deputies came running down the hall, but Moose got there first, and he just hauled this guy off of me. I'll never forget it. Just hauled him off, and the trial was a week-long trial. And this may have been like the first day. And so for the remainder of the week, no matter what was going on, there always seemed to be two deputies on either side of this guy sort of following him wherever he went. And he was perfectly appropriate after that. But I mean, I don't know if he would have been if there hadn't been two deputies trailing his every step. But yeah, I teased Moose an awful lot about that afterwards.
Well, he was obviously a presence.
Oh God, Moose was great. Yeah.
Funny. I remember that stuff. So you knew you were coming in today. Was there a question or two that you thought maybe Greg would ask that I haven't asked yet?
No, I never thought about what you would ask. That's a great question. I don't know. I didn't even think about it. You had said it was about why I went into law. So I was just laughing to myself, thinking about how I had thought about being a social worker, and I'm very glad I wasn't.
Yeah. Well, clearly that was an inclination of yours from the beginning. You know, whether you might have gone to the Peace Corps, just think about that. I mean, that's the road less traveled. The Peace Corps or the law school, you could have been that person. You know, it's or AmeriCorps or that teaching course type of thing. And I'm not sure in today's environment here in the Bar Association that there are so many women members. I mean, when you look at a composite today, it's significant. And yet here, only 45 years ago when you came, and Cindy, it was 2 or 3 with Julie, and that was it. What a difference a few decades makes.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's a whole different world. And you know, it's ironic in some ways. You talked about that Jackson Center program. I felt ancient afterwards when some of the kids came up and were asking me these questions, and they couldn't conceive that things were that way. Oh, was it really like that? You know, and it was just, you know, we just accepted that's the way it was.
Yeah, and I'd say that's part of this project, is frankly talking to folks who aren't that far removed from the practice, but nevertheless it gives a chance to understand what it was like, you know.
Yeah.
Do you ever, when they use the term, whether they've used it with you or not, they should have, as a trailblazer, do you see that at all?
I mean, people have used that word a number of times, and I won the 8th Judicial District Judicial Justice and Fairness Award one year. God, that was a long time ago, for being a trailblazer and all that. I don't think about it much now. I think I probably did then because I was so keenly aware back then, not of being a trailblazer, but of what I did. And this is part of the difference. What I did would impact the women who came after me. So I couldn't take things for granted. That was important. And that's the part that I think that sometimes people don't realize. They don't think about it because what they do only impacts themselves. Mm-hmm. So I thought about the clothes I wore. It's such a stupid thing, but I thought about the clothes I wore. Because if I wore something that was even slightly off in the early years, that's what people would remember. And they'd hold it against the women who came after me. Mm-hmm. Or the court clerk. And this was Donna Emo, who was a woman herself, and was I love Donna. Oh God, what a hoot she was. But Donna would always say, when she announced the cases coming in, we'd be coming into Supreme Court with Judge Ricotta or something, and she'd say, it's Mr. Burgett and Judy. And I would say, Donna, when you say that, I have a client in the room. And my client's going to think, is my attorney not as, you know, worthy as Mr. Burgett or whatever? You know, dumb little things like that. But I was always aware that there were women, there were bound to be, even though it was years before there were women, there were going to be women who would come after me, and everything I did was going to have an impact. It might make it easier, or it might make it harder for them. And I didn't want to make it harder at the very least.
Right. This is remarkable. Thank you. This is remarkable.
Well, thank you for taking the time to do this.